Welcome to the deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at something that's kind of all around us, really network effects.
Yeah.
And, you've sent in some super interesting stuff about huge companies and how they got that way, and railroads, even the telephone. Think about it, going all the way back to the 1800s.
Hmm.
It really makes you think, right? Like, these forces have been at play for, well, forever, haven't they?
It is fascinating to see how all these industries, so different on the surface, are all kind of tied together by this underlying principle, this idea of network effects, even back in the day.
So before we go too far, can we just take a second and define what we mean by network effects? I feel like everyone uses that term, but I don't know. I'm not sure I really get it, all the details.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You're right. We should make sure we're all on the same page here. So basically, a network effect, it happens when something, a product or a service, becomes more valuable the more people use it. Kind of like a snowball, right?
Hmm.
Rolling downhill, it gets bigger and bigger, picks up more snow, more momentum.
Okay, that makes sense. So like more people on a social media platform, then that platform's more valuable to each user because there's just more to do, more people to connect with.
Exactly. And, that's just one type of network effect, the direct kind. But there's also indirect effects, and that's where things get even more interesting, I think. These indirect ones happen when a network grows, and it kicks off growth in something else, a product or service that complements it.
Ooh, I like that. Give me an example. I got to hear this.
Well, just think about the internet back when it was new. As more people started going online, suddenly everyone wanted a web browser. And that demand, well, it led to all these better, more advanced browsers being developed. So the internet, a network itself, it kind of indirectly sparked this whole wave of innovation in the browser world.
Okay, I see what you mean. This ripple effect across all kinds of industries. This is really cool. So how does this all connect back to those historical things I sent you? The sources mention a financial panic in the 1870s, and wow, that sounds like a pretty intense place to start our little history lesson.
It was. Yeah, that's the Panic of 1873. Basically, it started when J. Cook and Company, they were a huge financier of railroads. They collapsed. And that set off this chain reaction of bankruptcies all through the railroad industry, massive unemployment, and, well, a huge economic downturn. The whole nine yards.
Wow, railroads causing an economic meltdown. Okay, I know they were important back then, but I wouldn't have guessed they had that much power.
It's wild, right? It might seem crazy to us now, but back then, railroads were the mega projects. They were as expensive as entire industries combined. So when things went wrong, overspending on railroads in this case, the effects rippled through the whole economy.
Okay, so maybe comparing it to like a tech bubble today isn't so off base after all. But if railroads were in such bad shape, how did this lead to the retail revolution you mentioned?
Well, that's the interesting part. The crash, yeah, it was devastating, but what it left behind was this giant network of railroads just sitting there,
Yeah.
waiting to be used. And that's where our friend Richard Sears comes in.
Ah, Sears. Yeah, I was looking forward to this part. This guy basically built a retail empire from nothing, right?
He did, and it's a classic example of someone using an existing network, brilliantly, I might add, to create something completely new. Sears, he was a station agent, just selling watches on the side. But he saw that those rail lines, they weren't being used to their full potential. So he had this idea, reach customers directly, cut out the middleman, the local stores.
So he was kind of like the Amazon of his time, you're saying, delivering straight to people's doors. I bet the local stores weren't too happy about that.
No, not at all.
Mm.
Sears could offer much lower prices because he was buying in bulk and, using that efficient rail network.
Mhm.
And it really resonated with customers, especially farmers. They often felt overcharged by those local general stores. Sears, he was clever. He positioned himself as like the champion of the everyday person fighting those inflated prices.
And to think this all started because of what? A bunch of overspending on railroads? It really shows how these events are all connected.
For sure. And there's more to this story. See, Sears wasn't just selling watches anymore. He had all sorts of goods, even perishable food.
Mhm.
And to make that work, he needed another piece of the network to fall into place, refrigeration.
Oh, right. The sources mentioned something about, was it an Ice King? Sounds a bit ominous, doesn't it?
Not as scary as it sounds.
Yeah.
This guy, Frederick Tudor, the Ice King, he was a fascinating character. He figured out how to harvest ice in winter, store it, then ship it all over using these special insulated rail cars. It was a total game changer for Sears and actually the whole food industry.
Hold on. So without the Ice King and his clever use of the rail network, Sears wouldn't have been able to build his empire. Wait a minute. This means that Sears's success was completely dependent on two networks that seemed totally unrelated, the railroads and, well, the ice trade.
Exactly. And it shows how these network effects, they're almost never just one thing. One innovation can trigger a whole bunch of others, creating new possibilities and disrupting whole industries.
This is blowing my mind. Okay, so we've seen how networks can create wealth, fuel innovation, but the sources you read also mentioned natural monopolies and kind of hinted that maybe there's a darker side to these network effects.
That's a really important point. And it brings us to another revolutionary technology, the telephone. As cool as the Sears story is, the telephone story, it shows us what can go wrong with network effects.
Okay, I'm ready for the next chapter in this network saga. Let's talk telephones.
So after Alexander Graham Bell's patents expired, the telephone industry, it just exploded. Tons of little independent companies popped up everywhere. But this chaotic free-for-all didn't last very long.
What happened? Why not?
Well, then came Theodore Vail. He used to work for the Postal Service, knew a lot about networks.
And not just any networks, right? I read his family. They were involved in building canals, steamships, the telegraph. It's like they were born to understand networks.
It really makes you wonder if that family history kind of led them to see the potential of networks in a way most people didn't. But anyway, back to Vail. He saw the telephone, not as a bunch of individual lines, but as one giant system, a network. The real value was in how it all connected together.
Yeah, and that's in that AT&T annual report from, I think it was 1908, right? The quote was, "A telephone without a connection is useless." They summed up their whole business model in one sentence.
Exactly. Then that became their justification for basically taking over the entire industry, forming this massive integrated network under AT&T. They argued that one unified system was more efficient and it would be better for everyone.
But wouldn't that mean less competition, less innovation? I mean, one company controlling the entire telephone network sounds a lot like, well, a monopoly.
It does. And that's the tricky part about network effects. They can create huge value and efficiency, but it can also lead to a lot of power concentrated in just a few hands that can stifle competition and innovation. It was a huge debate even back then, and it's even more relevant now with these giant tech companies.
Wow, this is some heavy stuff. So, railroads to retail empires and now the telephone, all connected by these network effects. It's clear they've shaped our world in some big ways, both good and bad. But I'm still trying to figure out, what does this all mean for me, for us, living in the 21st century?
That's the question, isn't it? And
Yeah.
that's where we need to shift gears a bit, move from the past to the present. Because
Yeah.
these forces that shape the railroads and everything else, they're shaping our digital lives now in ways we're only just starting to understand.
So let's bring it into the present then. Feels like we're just surrounded by networks everywhere you look, right?
Oh.
Social media, the internet, the financial systems, probably tons more I'm not even thinking of. How do we even start to untangle all of this and figure out how it's affecting us?
Yeah, no, it's true. It's getting more and more complex all the time, these networks. And like those historical examples we talked about, they can really shape, well, everything. How we communicate, how we get information, how we work, shop, even form relationships, you name it.
It's kind of mind-blowing, right? Like, we're all part of this giant web, and our lives are being pulled this way and that by, what, these invisible threads. But if that's true, how do we make sure those networks are working for us, not against us? Are we just, along for the ride?
That's the big question. It's not about escaping networks. That's just not possible these days. It's more about figuring out how they work, seeing the potential problems, and I guess developing strategies to navigate them, to use them to our advantage.
Okay, that makes sense. So give me some actionable advice. What should we be paying attention to?
Well, the first thing is you got to recognize that networks, they create opportunities and risks, right? They can help you reach more people, connect with others who share your interests, access information, resources you wouldn't have otherwise. But at the same time, they can also create echo chambers, make you vulnerable to, misinformation, and concentrate power in the hands of just a few.
So it's not as simple as saying networks are good or bad. It's how they're structured and how we choose to, participate in them. What are some things we can actually do to make sure we're on the right side of that, though?
One thing, be mindful of the platforms you're using, the information you're consuming. Ask yourself, are these sources making you think in new ways? Or are they just reinforcing what you already believe? Are they empowering you, or are they trying to manipulate you, your emotions, your behavior?
Oh, that's a good point. It's so easy to fall into that trap, just reading stuff that agrees with you, but that just leads to those echo chambers you were talking about, right? You only get one side of the story.
That's right. And it's not just about the information itself, it's the networks we choose to be a part of, right? The online communities, are they having healthy discussions, respectful debates, or are they just spreading negativity and, well, division?
It's easy to forget that online spaces are still communities with real people, real consequences. We got to treat them with the same respect we treat any other community.
Absolutely. And don't forget about building your own networks. Could be a professional, could be people who share your hobbies, could even just be close friends and family, a strong support system.
So you're saying instead of relying on these massive platforms, we should be thinking about creating our own smaller, more, I guess, intentional networks.
Exactly. The more diverse and, well, robust your personal network is, the better off you'll be. It's about tapping into that collective intelligence, getting support, not just relying on a few big platforms for everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like having different paths for information, for support, instead of putting all your eggs in one basket. But building and maintaining those networks, that takes effort, right? It's not going to just happen on its own.
You're right. It means being proactive about the connections we make both online and offline. It's an ongoing thing. You got to nurture those relationships, provide value, be there for others.
So it's not just about what you get out of a network, but what you put in too.
That's it. And don't be afraid to, step outside your comfort zone, connect with people who are different from you, have different perspectives. That's where the real magic happens.
Love that. Cross-pollination for the mind, that's what it is. Seeing new ideas, different ways of thinking, it can only make you a better, more well-rounded person, right?
Right. And the more diverse your network, the less you're going to fall prey to those downsides we talked about, those echo chambers of manipulation.
This has been so helpful. I'm already looking at the networks in my own life differently. But before we finish up, I want to touch on something you said earlier about how networks are always changing. How do we keep up with that? It feels like things are changing so fast these days.
Yeah, that's a big challenge, for sure. What works today might be totally irrelevant tomorrow. New platforms pop up, old ones disappear, and who has the power? Well, that's always in flux.
Okay. So how do we, I don't know, stay ahead of the curve?
The key is to stay curious, stay flexible, be willing to learn and adapt. Don't be afraid to try new platforms, check out different communities, connect with people who challenge your thinking.
That's great advice. So we've covered the history of networks, how they're shaping our lives right now, and some tips for navigating them. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is networks aren't just some abstract idea. They're these living, breathing systems, and we're all a part of them. And they have a huge impact on our lives, whether we realize it or not.
So where do we go from here? What do we do with this knowledge?
I think it starts with, just taking a look at the networks you're a part of right now, the ones that are kind of hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've been talking about these huge historical things, but, well, these forces are working on us every day too, aren't they?
Exactly. So think about the networks that are helping you do the things you love, connect with people you care about, even just the ones that make your day-to-day life possible. What are the networks that are helping you grow? Be your best self.
That's a good way to look at it, like taking stock of your network, seeing what's already working for you. But I bet there are some networks that aren't so great too, right?
Oh, for sure. You got to ask yourself, are there networks that are holding you back, limiting what you can do, maybe even reinforcing bad habits? Are there connections that drain your energy, keep you stuck in a rut?
Like shining a light on those blind spots. The places where we might be part of networks that aren't really doing us any favors.
That's it. And once you can see those networks, for what they are, you can make better choices about how you're involved in them. Maybe it's about spending less time in certain online groups or finding new connections that match your values, your goals.
Right. It's not about getting rid of networks altogether. We know that's not realistic. It's more about, I guess, choosing carefully which ones we want to cultivate and support.
Exactly. And remember, these things are always in motion. New connections popping up, old ones fading away. And who's got the power? Well, that changes all the time, too.
It's like a dance, right? And we're all trying to learn the steps as we go. It can be a little overwhelming, but I don't know, there's something empowering about it, too. We're not just like pawns in this game. We can actually shape these networks, make them work for us.
That's what it's all about, understanding these network effects so we can participate in them in a way that's beneficial. We can make those good connections stronger, deal with the bad ones, and really build the kinds of networks that make us better, both as individuals and as a society.
This has been so eye-opening. I'm looking at networks in a totally different way now.
I'm glad to hear that. And, I hope you feel like you can actually use this knowledge, use the power of networks to make good things happen. Remember, they have so much potential to connect us, to make positive changes in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to everyone listening, we hope this has given you a new understanding of the power of networks, how they're affecting your life. Keep exploring, keep connecting, and don't ever underestimate what a single connection can do. It might just be the start of something amazing.